Well, the weather outside isn't very conducive to quad flying, so thought I'd stay inside and work on one of my tech projects. I've had a number of Lotus T380 quadcopters. 2 are still flying. Question's always been asked, are three-bladed props better than two-bladed? To answer this question, I built this thrust measuring gauge. The design of the gauge allows me to easily change motors It's also much easier to install the motors separately. With this device, I can accurately measure the RPM, the power draw, and the thrust that the propeller generates for any given RPM. I can change the RPM in 500 RPM intervals and measure the power draw and the thrust at those points. That gives me a performance curve for the motor and propeller combination. That's roughly 3,000 RPM. 3,000 RPM, we have a thrust of 144 grams, and the motor is drawing 1.84 amps. Because the motors don't use any clips to hold the props on, it makes it very easy to change the propellers. And here's a two-blade prop running at 3,000 RPM. It only generates 64 grams of thrust and is drawing 0.67 amps, very low power. What you can see when the two-bladed prop winds up, it actually draws out of the motor quite a bit. 7,100 RPM. Same can be said for the three-bladed prop. It draws out as well. But only winds up to about 4,850 RPM. Again, recording the information at multiple RPMs allows you to create a graph and compare. The blue line is the two-bladed prop. The red line is the three-bladed prop. On the bottom axis we have RPM. On the vertical axis we have the thrust. So they typically generate the same amount of thrust over their range, even though one spins at a much lower RPM. This is a graph of the power curve showing amps on the horizontal axis and thrust on the vertical axis. Again, the red line is the three-bladed prop, the blue line is the two-bladed prop. As you can see, the red line is to the right of the blue one. For any given amount of thrust shown on the vertical axis, the three-bladed prop draws more current, which means it's less efficient. Overall, from these two data graphs, it's evident to me that there is no advantage to using three-bladed props on a T380. Basically, you'll use up your batteries quicker. The other thing the graphs allow you to determine is when you know the total aircraft flying weight, which in this case is 800 grams, with the graphs you can determine how much RPM propellers will you turn and how much current it's going to use to take off. In this case, these for 200 grams, because there's 4 propellers, 200 grams of thrust each, means that with the 2-bladed props, they'd be going about 5,200 RPM, and at 200 grams of thrust each, they would draw about 2.5 amps each. So the total power draw for 4 motors would be about 10 amps. Using that and your battery capacity, you can predict how long your quad will fly. I hope this little tech talk has helped you decide whether you should spend the money on 3-bladed props or not. If you thought this was a helpful video, give it a like, and why not subscribe?